It is the final Awesemo live before lock for the NBA preseason. The preseason's wrapping up. Then we finally have the regular season starting. The preseason's been nice, but the real thing's going to be so much better once we finally get to it. So just 3 preseason games to wade through tonight, and then we've got the regular season starting. Adam, how excited are you for actual real NBA action to start this week?
Yeah, really, really excited. By the time preseason wraps up, you're kind of tired of dealing with preseason basketball, but it always feels like I'm really ready for the regular season to get here because I'm caught up on, who plays for what teams and all of that kind of stuff. So ready to get going.
And don't forget, also, we do have a special promo code running for just $1. You can get NBA access through December 29th. That covers the first week of the NBA regular season. And that'll give you access to the NBA projections, our ownership projections, our Slack chat, lineup builder, and everything else that's up on the website. That is using the promo code Caruso for all new customers, and just $1. So you want to dip your toes into the waters of NBA DFS. This is the best way to get action on all of our content and get into NBA DFS. Just $1, so you're not really risking anything. Also, do us a favor, like the video, subscribe to the Awesemo Podcast Network, subscribe to the YouTube channel, so that you could get informed when we finally do start talking about actual NBA regular season and the preseason is finally over and done with. First game on the slate here, we'll talk about these games. The Orlando Magic taking on the Charlotte Hornets. From the Orlando side of the game, we have a starting lineup of Markelle Fultz, Evan Fournier, Dwayne Bacon, Aaron Gordon, and Nikola Vucevic. It's a starting lineup they've been running out here for the entire preseason. We have Aminu, Bamba, and James Ennis. All 3 of them are out. So what do you make of this starting lineup here, Adam? And then also say this, with this being the final 3 games of the NBA preseason, how do you think that'll impact how teams run their rotations heading into the regular season?
Yeah, I think it's always kind of tough in the last game if you don't have a coach telling you exactly what they're going to do, because on the one hand, you can treat it like the previous games, but on the other hand, sometimes you do have coaches kind of take things easy in the final game. I'm leaning towards, in spots where we don't really get an answer one way or the other from coaches, I'm leaning towards treating it like the previous game because this was a shortened preseason. They really had to ramp things up pretty quickly to get in shape for the regular season. So unless we get word that they're changing what they've been doing, I'm not adding additional minutes on in most cases, like where Vooch played 30 plus minutes last game, I'm not giving him another 2 minutes tonight, but I still have him in for 30. Same goes for Markelle Fultz. And we do have the same Orlando starting lineup. We've kind of seen the same thing from them every game of this preseason. The one thing that did change last game was you got Terrence Ross back, which took some value away from Michael Carter-Williams, took some value away from Cole Anthony. But beyond that, I think you're still looking to this team, particularly Fultz and Vooch, as the guys that you really feel good about. Fournier is a solid value at 4,800 on DraftKings. He's washed and bad and all of that, but it's a 3-game slate. He's 4,800. He played 30 minutes last game. You're not going to feel good about it, but he's definitely one of the better projected pay down options.
Yeah, so the one guy who I'd say in the starting lineup that really isn't viable to me is going to be Aaron Gordon. And the reason is because they've really limited his minutes in the preseason. They started by just playing him 16 minutes. They've been ramping up a little bit, but even so, last game we got 23 minutes from Aaron Gordon. So to your point, we got over 30 minutes from Fournier, Fultz, and Vucevic last game. And Fournier really struggled in his 30 minutes, but just you have somebody who's an established NBA player that's cheap that we could expect to get around 30 minutes from. To your point, yeah, that makes him a valuable option. The problem with Aaron Gordon is just those minutes. When you have all these other guys that we think are viable starters that are going to be playing, 30-ish minutes, it's hard to get on Aaron Gordon as somebody who's probably going to be playing, like 25 minutes or something like that. In terms of the bench players, is there anybody here that really interests you? Because to me, it's hard to get behind any of these guys when all of them played under 20 minutes last game.
The one thing I will add to Aaron Gordon, I agree with you completely on DraftKings. He is viable on FanDuel where there's no salaries. And so you're just talking about raw points. When you look at the power forward position there, you have John Collins, you have PJ Washington, you have Blake Griffin, who's probably playing around 25 minutes. I think Gordon is certainly in like the power forward 2 conversation on FanDuel. But, outside of that, on where you do have salaries, the minutes are concerning. As far as the bench goes, no, I don't really have interest there. If you're talking large field tournaments and you're playing a bunch of lineups, then maybe hoping that you get like a hot shooting Terrence Ross or Cole Anthony is fine. But as you said, the minutes decreased for those guys last game, or decreased for Cole Anthony, decreased for Carter Williams. You had Ross come back and play 18 minutes. I'm assuming that you're getting somewhere in like the 18 to 22 minute range from Terrence Ross. I'm assuming you'll get Carter Williams and Anthony around 20 minutes apiece again. It makes both of them just guys that you can't really trust in that amount of playing time. The only way that you really get to them is if you're playing a number of lineups and you're just starting to try and find, guys that potentially, like, they'll all shoot when they're on the floor, which is more than you can say for a lot of cheap players on this slate. But beyond that, talking about your 20th tournament lineup or something, I don't really see a reason.
Yeah, and that's why if I absolutely had to roster one of these guys, it would probably be Cole Anthony for me. Price still under 5K. And you look at what he's done in the preseason, he's shown to be, a pretty decent permanent fantasy producer, just because, to your point, when he gets on the court, he shoots. I mean, if you were to comp him to an NBA player, it's probably like Jordan Clarkson right now, where you saw him last game. He played 19 minutes, took 7 shots, 13 rebounds, 4 assists, 13 points, 4 rebounds, 4 assists. I think you're stretching to roster him, but on a 3-game slate where you absolutely have to roster some of these guys in certain situations if you're going deep, then I think that he would be the guy. But definitely if you're playing one lineup, I don't think there's any need to roster any of the Orlando Magic bench guys. Talking about the Charlotte Hornets side of the game, unfortunately, no starting lineup yet. The one thing we do know, Gordon Hayward is out. He's dealing with a broken finger because if you touch him, he just falls apart. That's what Gordon Hayward happens to him now. I don't know if you saw, but the Hornets put out a promo shoot in really bad lighting, and it made Gordon Hayward look like a zombie, where it just looked like his entire body was disintegrating. And I'm starting to think, like, maybe that just is what he looks like now. It wasn't the lighting. That's just Gordon Hayward, because they just had his whole body look purple and, like, decrepit. But anyway, he is out. Last game, they started Cody Martin at small forward. I'm not necessarily totally sure that that's going to be the case again. I know that Jordan, behind the scenes, huge fan of the Martin brothers. For some reason, he gets really excited when they're on the court together. But Cody Martin maybe starts again, maybe doesn't. I actually think that Miles Bridges is mildly more interesting, even if Cody Martin starts. And I kind of hope that people will gravitate towards Martin if he's in the starting lineup, because Miles Bridges is somebody who's established as a player who scores around a fantasy point per minute. If he comes off the bench, there is added usage for him. It's a better situation for him in terms of shots if he comes off the bench and doesn't have to compete with Terry Rozier and Devontae Graham for touches. And if you look at what Miles Bridges did last game, he still played 23 minutes off the bench. So at his price point, I think that he's a viable option, and I'd actually prefer him coming off the bench than starting.
Yeah, I prefer him off the bench too. He doesn't get enough minutes for me to be prioritizing him, but he is someone you can take a shot on in tournaments. They have, James Borrego has talked about wanting or liking the matchup that Miles Bridges gives off the bench as the backup 4. He said he thinks that's something that Charlotte can take advantage of during the regular season. So I'm with you. We don't know who is starting in Hayward's spot for sure, but we did have Martin last game, played around 24 minutes. I have Bridges in for like 22 or 23 minutes here. Neither of those guys super appealing to me, but Bridges, I would say Bridges over Martin. The guy off the bench for Charlotte that I'm really, or potentially off the bench that I am really interested in, though, is a $5,300 LaMelo Ball on DraftKings. The salary it's increased a little bit, but it hasn't increased much. And he's looked good from a fantasy standpoint. He's produced 1.15 DraftKings points per minute in the preseason so far. He has a 27% usage rate. He's rebounding well. He's getting assists. But on top of that, you have James Borrego talking about wanting to get Ball more playing time with Devontae Graham. That was prior to the last game. And, just kind of wanting to see different things out of him. So all those things kind of work together to make me feel pretty confident in his minutes. Not that he necessarily gets 30 or anything like that, but I think it would be pretty surprising if you're not getting at least 24 or 25 minutes from LaMelo Ball, if not more. And that's a really cheap price point. So I like getting to him a lot off the bench. And then, as far as the starters go, this is another team that sets up similarly to Orlando, where without news on exactly what they plan on doing, I'm treating it like the last game, and I'm expecting around 30 minutes for Devontae Graham. I'm expecting around 30 minutes for Terry Rozier and PJ Washington, making all of those guys, I think, pretty solid plays.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing, too, with LaMelo Ball is, if you're not playing him big minutes here, then when are you going to, right? Because it seems like he's going to be coming off the bench to start the regular season. I think you want to get LaMelo Ball as many minutes as possible here. Just get him really geared up for the start of the regular season. And he's looked good in the preseason. I think as a scorer, he's always going to be inconsistent, and I don't think he's going to be particularly efficient. But I think he might be a slightly better shooter than Lonzo. And then he has a lot of the other peripheral stats that Lonzo brings to the table. We've seen the assists from him. We've seen the rebounds. We've seen him be able to rack up the defensive stats. So everything points towards Lonzo Ball being a really good DFS permanent fantasy producer. And I also think it helps him that he comes off the bench and he isn't splitting touches with Devontae Graham and Terry Rozier. So I think of those three guards, even though Lonzo Ball isn't the starter, I do think that he, like you said, is the best of those guys to target. Other guys here, PJ Washington, specifically for FanDuel, I think he's a very strong play because, like you mentioned with Aaron Gordon, you have to consider him on FanDuel just because there's so few power forward options there. So PJ Washington, I think, is one of the top power forward options on FanDuel. Any thoughts on somebody like Cody Zeller?
Zeller concerns me just because we haven't seen his playing time trend with the other main pieces. Even the last game from Zeller, you had 17, just about 18 minutes. I have him in for about 20 minutes here. He's cheap enough where if you're running multiple lineups, you can start to get to him. But the problem is that, at least with the information that we have right now, there are centers that I really like on this slate, whether it's Vooch on the other side of this game. We'll talk about Thomas Bryant. We'll talk about Clint Capella. I think that the position, you have Jonas Valanciunas as well. The position's pretty stacked. So Zeller's not the highest upside player as is. He's not someone that is very likely to go out there and give you a monster fantasy score. But then on top of that, you're expecting him to play fewer minutes than all of these really, really good producers as well. So it gets really difficult for me to give up that center spot for Cody Zeller.
Yeah, and here's the thing with Zeller. Earlier in the preseason, I thought he was moderately interesting because there were high-priced guards to pay up for, and Zeller was 43 or 4,100, if I remember correctly. Now we have Zeller at 4,800. He also used to have power forward eligibility. Now Zeller only has center eligibility. His price has gone up to 4,800, and we don't have a slate with like a James Harden, Luka Doncic type player to pay up for. So that's also what makes Zeller a much lower priority for me. And then, some of these other guys, Graham, Rozier, not necessarily guys that are high on my priority list, but I think they're viable just because it's such a thin slate with only 3 games. Anybody else that you think Warren's talking about from the Hornets side of the game?
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. Like, when I look at my top lineups, I'm getting a lot of PJ Washington. I'm getting a lot of LaMelo Ball. And then you can see some like Rozier or Devontae Graham kind of trickling in. But when you factor in salary and all of that, it's not the priority for me. Again, on FanDuel, I think Graham in particular does look really good from a raw point perspective at shooting guard. But where you have the salaries, I'm really mostly interested in Washington and LaMelo Ball. One other kind of, I thought about it when you were talking about, if you're not going to play Ball decent minutes here, when are you? But the other thing too is, like, if Ball doesn't play decent minutes, my assumption is that this entire team just like went to shit and they just ran like a really weird rotation, because like, why would it seems really unlikely that they would be like, okay, we're going to run like full minutes for Terry Rozier, but not for LaMelo Ball. So he kind of just really seems like the safest in that regard too.
Yeah, totally agree. He's my favorite play from the Charlotte side of this game. And then you mentioned right there for value that you like the Washington their game. So let's talk about them next. The Washington Wizards taking on the Detroit Pistons. We do have a starting lineup for Washington, and we do have Russell Westbrook making his Wizards debut. Bradley Beal is in the starting lineup. But with that said, neither of them are expected to play big minutes. They've been limited. Well, Beal has been limited in the one game we saw him play. Westbrook is yet to play in the preseason. Then we've got Denny in the starting lineup, Anthony Gill, who we were trying to figure out who that is before the show started, and then Thomas Bryant starting at center. So amongst that starting lineup, I think it's pretty easy to say that neither Westbrook nor Beal make for priority plays given the likely limited minutes. What do you make of these other guys who are in the starting lineup?
Yeah, I think for the most part, Washington's pretty ugly. Westbrook, they're expecting to play. Brooks said around 17 minutes. We had Beal only play the first half last time out. I have him in for about 20 minutes here, but without confirmation that he's playing more. I don't feel comfortable going higher than that. You do have the rookie, Arvija, I think, back in the starting lineup. He played 32 minutes off the bench last game. He is someone I feel confident in his minutes, or relatively confident in his minutes, because, there's no reason for them not to want to play him more. They've said that there's a good chance he's going to be starting at small forward. He's only $4,700 at a really bad small forward position. Like on DraftKings, you're kind of just rolling the dice on guys with pretty legitimate question marks at that position. So I have no issue going to him. I'm not interested in Gill. I honestly don't know anything about him other than he's played overseas for 4 years. I don't anticipate him getting huge run here. He played 4 minutes at the end of the game last time out. It's not like he's a guy that has there's any reason to think he's like in their rotation in the regular season. I'm not looking at him as someone like, oh, they want to, like, I don't see it as like a situation where they're like, oh, we want to see what he has to see exactly how he slots in. Like, I don't think he's close to this rotation. So I'm not interested in him. And then Thomas Bryant, I do think is interesting. You got about 26 minutes from him last game. I'm pulling it back up now, but going from memory, I think it was about 26.
It was 28 for him and 32 for Denny.
Okay, yeah. So 28 and a half minutes for Thomas Bryant. That was only in 3 quarters too. So there's plenty more room if they wanted to give it to him. I have him in for 26 or 27 minutes here, but even if that's the case at 6,200, he's going to project as a pretty strong option. He's over a fantasy point per minute player. So it's basically Bryant and Denny drawing interest for me from Washington.
Yeah, and then off the bench, if I had to shout out a couple of guys that I think could be viable, Isaac Bonga, he played 33 minutes last game. He's 4,500. So if you really need a cheap forward option, I think that he could come into play there. Somebody else that I kind of think is interesting is, what do you make of Mo Wagner here? Because he was somebody who I thought made for a great value play the last time he started. And then he just kind of sucked. But he played decent minutes, and now he's coming off the bench. If we don't think that Anthony Gill is playing, like 30 minutes or anything like that, then I still think it's possible that Mo Wagner, who's almost min price, he's 4,100. I think it's possible that we get, 25 minutes or so out of him. And if that's the case, he is a guy who's still a good permanent fantasy producer, and nobody's going to want to roster him after he was chalk and sucked last late.
Yeah, so Wagner, I think, is interesting in tournaments because I think that there is a lot of room for error kind of on his minutes. I was going to be really interested in him if he drew the start again in place of Rui, but obviously he's not. So I have him projected for 18 minutes, and I think that there's a good chance that he doesn't play enough to be a really good option because you do have Davis Bertans back playing 15 minutes. You still have Bonga that's going to get run, or you expect to get run. You have Gill getting, at the very least, a placeholder start. Troy Brown's still going to get minutes. Assuming Robin Lopez is going to get his 13 or 14 minutes, it's pretty easy to see how Wagner would get squeezed into like 16 to 18 minutes tonight. But the thing that I think makes him interesting in tournaments is, like you said, nobody's really going to be in a hurry to go back to him. He's not... The value isn't super necessary on the slate. So it's not like people are going to just like hold their nose and put him in their lineup. But when I do kind of gamble on minutes on players where I'm really not sure about their minutes, you want to do it on guys that are actually good per minute producers. And that's certainly the case for Wagner, who's over a fantasy point per minute guy. So I think the most likely outcome, and I'll even say I'm relatively confident, is that he's playing like 16 to 18 minutes and probably getting 16 to 18 fantasy points. But it certainly wouldn't be the first time that I've just been completely wrong. And he plays 24 minutes and ends up, 6Xing at 4,100 and no ownership. So not someone that's getting close to my cash lineup coming off the bench because I'm just not confident. But, he is at least someone that if he somehow finds his way into more minutes than I'm expecting, he's very likely to capitalize on that.
And then the Pistons side of the game, no starting lineup here. We've seen them be pretty conservative with minutes so far in the preseason. Starters all playing, 20 to 22-ish minutes. So that makes it really hard for me to prioritize these guys. But Killian Hayes, Delon Wright, Jeremy Grant, Blake Griffin, and Mason Plumlee, that has been the starting lineup that they've been rolling out in recent games. And the starting lineup in terms of minutes last game, we got 25 from Griffin, 22 from Grant. Nobody else played more than 20. That makes it really hard for me to look at these guys and be like, hey, anybody's a really strong play. And the other thing too, Blake Griffin, who was at one point, 4,800, 5,200, he's up to 5,600 on DraftKings now. So on FanDuel, where he's just playing a thin position, I think he's viable. But on DraftKings, I don't really think any of these guys make for especially strong plays. Do you see it any differently?
Not too differently. There's definitely not anyone that I'm really comfortable in. I will point out, first off, Josh Jackson at 4,500. The small forward position is just so weak. And you have Josh Jackson at 4,500. You have Jeremy Grant at 4,600. Both of these guys probably, and again, this is, a kind of educated guess, but, somewhere in the 22 to 25 minute range. Josh Jackson for his career is close to a 1 fantasy point per minute guy. It's been kind of other issues that have kept him off the court. But when he gets on the floor, he generally produces. So if you think you're going to get 22 to 24 minutes from Josh Jackson at 4,500, he's certainly viable. And then Jeremy Grant has really struggled so far, but he comes in so far this preseason with a 28% usage rate. He's been really inefficient, which I don't think is too surprising when you talk about someone with Jeremy Grant's offensive skill set taking on a higher usage role. But he's probably not going to be as inefficient as he has been forever. And the opportunities are there at the very least, which is more than you can say for most of this position. So I don't mind taking shots on either of them. And then Derrick Rose is kind of interesting to me at 5,700. He's not someone that I trust because it's Derrick Rose in a preseason game. But if you're going to get 22 to 24 minutes from him, which is what we got last time out, no guarantee it happens again. But, he's going back to the start of last year. He's averaged like 1.2 DraftKings points per minute. and he's 5,700. So if he gets to that minute range again, I think he ends up being a good play. The reason he's not a priority, though, is just that I feel more confident in either finding like $300 and getting to Markelle Fultz, or in saving $400 and rostering LaMelo Ball.
Yeah, and then the other thing too about the minutes of Derrick Rose and it limited playing 22 minutes or whatever. He didn't play that much more than that in the regular season last year anyway, when he was a fairly good fantasy producer. So if you're looking at Derrick Rose in terms of him being limited, I mean, he wasn't a guy who the Pistons generally played 30 plus minutes anyway. So those minutes are not all that far off from what we would typically expect from him. So I think that makes sense. To your point on Josh Jackson, I think he's sensible. Also, he played 24 minutes last game. I know people are asking about him in the chat. 17.7 rebounds, 2 assists last game. It's good to see somebody who comes out, plays 24 minutes off the bench, takes 11 shots. So Josh Jackson, this is potentially his last stop in the NBA, is like a final chance for him after all the places that he's burned out of. So you could see that if you want to play a narrative street, the type of guy like this that's really fighting for his NBA career and his roster spot, it stands to reason that when he's on the floor, he's going to want to shoot. He's trying to make something happen. This isn't a guy who could really afford to just be a low usage guy who stands in the corner in a preseason game. He's trying to make a roster. So if you want to play the narrative angle like that, I think that's another reason it makes sense to roster somebody like Josh Jackson.
Yeah, and it's not like, standing in the corner is his game anyway. Even if you go back to Memphis last year, I believe he played between 400 and 500 minutes for the Grizzlies, and he averaged like 0.99 DraftKings points per minute. He's always been one of those guys that is much better from a DFS standpoint than from a real life standpoint. And really the biggest issue from the thing that's always made him risky in DFS is that he's very prone to getting yanked out of games for doing something stupid on the floor. That's less of an issue in the preseason as well. So I do think Jackson is one of the better value small forwards on the slate, which isn't saying much, but I think he looks pretty good.
All right, and just one game left to talk about, and then who knows, maybe we'll get some starting lineups from the Pistons or Hornets, and we'll have something to circle back on. But in the meantime, no starting lineups for the final game on the slate. That is the Memphis Grizzlies playing the Atlanta Hawks. Starting with the Grizzlies side of the game, we currently have Dillon Brooks, Tillman, Tilly. They are all questionable play. Jonte Porter also questionable. Justice Winslow, he's out because he's always out. Jaren Jackson, he's out because of knee surgery. So starting lineup is probably going to look something like John Morant, D'Anthony Melton, Brandon Clarke, and Jonas Valanciunas, and then maybe Dillon Brooks if he ends up in there. Of these guys, I've kind of gravitated towards Melton a little bit in the preseason just because he's a guy who we've seen at times be a really strong permanent fantasy producer. So I think that he's an okay option. Amongst these other guys, Morant is fine. I'd rather pay up for Trey Young, but in terms of pay up options, actually, I think this is an interesting talking point. The three legitimate pay up options on the slate are for Trey Young, John Morant, Jonas Valanciunas, and Nikola Vucevic. Who do you think is the best of those four?
I think Vooch is the top one for me, followed by Young, followed by Ja and Jovel.
Yeah, I think I feel the same way, particularly on Trey Young versus Morant, because one thing we've seen in the preseason, Morant's getting priced up as if he's like Giannis or he's Luka or something like that. And this isn't a knock on Morant. He's fine as a fantasy producer, but I don't know that he should be priced in the same range as somebody like Trey Young yet, who's a guy who we saw average right around 50 fantasy points per game last year. Like Morant had a very good rookie season. He's probably going to improve in year two, but he averaged under 40 fantasy points per game last year. So when you consider that, I think it's a little bold to just all of a sudden be pricing him all the way up around Trey Young. So if you're in like a 1v1 situation trying to figure out who to play, that's why I lean towards Young over Morant. Amongst other guys on the Grizzlies, who do you like as the top plays?
Yeah, so I'll mention Kyle Anderson here as another just really unexciting small forward option, but you have to roster somebody. Really regardless, but I was going to say if Dillon Brooks is out, there's the potential for more usage. But so far this preseason, obviously in a small sample, but Anderson's rebounding rate has been higher than it was last year. And he has been playing the 4, which, it makes sense that it would go up a little bit. His usage has been a bit higher, up to 19%. I expect him to play around 24 minutes. He's 5,300 on DraftKings. So he's in that same conversation with Benny, Josh Jackson, Jeremy Grant as guys that, you can just roster as a cheap small forward and hope for the best. I don't think there's a whole lot separating them. Beyond that, I think that I agree with you on Morant. He's one of those guys that he's interesting though, because like if his salary were to be lower, he just ends up being massively owned every slate because the ceiling is so high and the opportunities that he has in that offense are so high. It's just kind of like he has to kind of be either over projected for his median, or he's going to be under projected for his ceiling, or underpriced for his ceiling. I mean, so I think that it's I slightly prefer Trey Young to Morant, but I think that'll also be the consensus. So it is a spot where in tournaments, I expect there to be more ownership on Nikola Vucevic. I expect there to be more ownership on Trey Young. Functionally, from a ceiling standpoint, there's really no difference between them. So that is a spot that I think you can look to in tournaments, kind of just take the slightly lower projected, lower owned guy and hope that he happens to be the one that has the best game.
All right. And then also talking about Dillon Brooks and his situation, even if he plays, I think he's somebody who's pretty easy to fade. I mean, on DraftKings, he's 6,700. That's a ton to play for Dillon Brooks, who I don't think would ever project as a good play at that price, even in a regular season game. And then we also have to consider, with him being listed as questionable and uncertain if he plays or not, how many minutes are they even going to want to give Dillon Brooks in a preseason game? So I can't see myself wanting to roster him at that kind of price point.
Yeah, the price point is tough. He's always a high upside guy because he just shoots so much. And he's said that one of the biggest part of his game that he's looking to improve on this year is his playmaking. Joval made a joke after their last game that even Dillon Brooks was passing the ball, which I thought was kind of funny. But at 6,700, it's just not someone that's really going to stand out. Like, if he's in, the most I could say for him is that he gives you probably a higher ceiling than these other small forward options on DraftKings, but you're also paying a premium for it. So it would still be pretty tough to get there. If he's out, it opens up more usage for guys like Morant, also for, Kyle Anderson. I think that the starting lineup would be interesting, whether you get both of Grayson Allen and DeAnthony Melton in there, or if Brandon Clarke slides back into the starting lineup. But we probably won't have information on that until that's the only game left on the slate. But you do potentially get some value opening up if Brooks does sit.
So the other thing also with Brandon Clarke, we saw this from a ton. Oh, by the way, we actually just got a starting lineup from the Grizzlies. Dillon Brooks is in. They're starting Morant, Melton, Brooks, Kyle Anderson, and Jonas Valanciunas. So what do you make of that information?
So it's
Morant, Melton, Dillon Brooks, so he's in, Kyle Anderson, and then Valanciunas.
Okay, so Morant, Melton, Brooks, Anderson, Valanciunas.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that's their game 2 starting lineup. So basically, they've just been using the same starting lineup and then switching DeAnthony Melton and Grayson Allen back and forth. I'm going to pull it up now to see. I think Melton played like 25 minutes or something in that range when he started. Trying to find it. The 14th, so the 14th, Melton started, played 24 minutes and 49 seconds. So I'm expecting probably like 25 minutes for DeAnthony Melton. I don't think it makes him a great play. I think it makes him at least viable in the conversation with like Evan Fournier, but I still think that I would prefer Bogdan Bogdanovic over both of them.
Yeah, and then I think amongst these other guys off the bench, trying to see if there's any of them that really stand out. Like, we've had Brandon Clarke. I think if he was a little cheaper, I'd find interest in him, but 5,600, that's a little bit steep of a price. If you want to consider him on FanDuel, where the price doesn't matter as much in the thin power forward position, I'm fine with Clarke there. Amongst other guys, though, I don't know. There's nobody who's really popping to me as a great play. Part of the issue also is that there aren't really any of these guys that are like 4,000 off the bench. A lot of these guys like Desmond Bane played decently in the preseason, but he's all the way up to 4,700. If he was min price, maybe I could consider him. Grayson Allen, who's probably not afraid to shoot when he's in the game, but he's at 5,000. So that's a little high for me to pay for him coming off the bench, where he might have his minutes limited. I think, to me, still the best value play on the Grizzlies is going to be Melton, just for the reasons I said before. He's a guy, he could pick up a lot of steals really quickly. We've seen him be a guy who's a good permanent fantasy producer when he gets the minutes. He's also a high variance player, so not somebody I'd consider in a cash game. But for GPP, I think that Melton is the guy relative to his price that I think has the most upside on the Grizzlies. Yeah,
I think I'd agree with that. And he does fill in at a weak position. Like, I know trying to build my optimal lineup on DraftKings, the shooting guard position is one of the ones that I've kind of been rotating through, saying like, okay, do I want Evan Fournier? Do I want Bogdan Bogdanovic? Now you get a $4,900 Melton you can throw in there as well. Like I said, I do still prefer Bogdanovic, but if you were stuck on Evan Fournier and couldn't quite afford Bogdanovic, now it's only $100 to get the Melton at least.
All right. And then on the other side of the game, the final team left for us to talk about, the Atlanta Hawks. No starting lineup for them yet. We do have a whole bunch of guys here listed as questionable. Clint Capella, Cam Reddish. Those two guys are questionable. Then already ruled out, we have Chris Dunn, Rajon Rondo, Tony Snell, and the rookie Okongwu. All of those guys have already been ruled out. So with all the injury situations here, who is it that you like at Atlanta? I think the one guy that's very easy to pinpoint is going to be Trey Young. I think he's an elite pay-up option on this slate. And then as there always is with preseason, there's a handful of guys in the 4K range that are viable. So it's not all that difficult to get up to Trey Young. So he would be my number one overall priority on Atlanta. And is there anybody else that really stands out to you?
Yeah, so Young's my top priority from Atlanta as well. He played about 28 minutes last game. He did sub out like in a blowout, which I don't know if that's it was a weird spot in the game for him to sub out. So it seemed like it was blowout related, but like, why would it be blowout related? But either way, I think, maybe there is the potential for a little bit more run there. But even if you're getting like 26, 27 minutes from Trey Young on the slate, that's perfectly fine. His usage has been down in the preseason, which I think is notable just because of thinking about this team versus last year. There's a lot more guys on this team to shoot. But there's also more guys that can score when Young passes them the ball. And on top of that, there's still going to be plenty of games that he just takes over offensively. So I don't want to read too much into the drop in usage. He's still certainly been productive. I'm expecting the minutes to be there. And I do think that he's the second best pay-up option on the slate behind Vooch, in my opinion, and the top guy from Atlanta. Beyond him, though, you still get the guys. You have John Collins, who fills in at a pretty weak power forward position, played 29 minutes last game. You have Bogdanovic, who started last game. I haven't seen an Atlanta starting lineup yet, but started and played 29 minutes. I think even if you get 26 or 27 minutes from Bogdanovic, he's one of the better value shooting guard options on the slate. And then Clint Capella, only $5,700 on DraftKings, played 26 minutes or 25 minutes in their last game. He's pretty much always a productive, point per minute guy. And that's a cheap enough price tag where I think if you're trying to pay up for Vooch, you're trying to pay up for either Young or Morant, you can save some money with a guy that still has a pretty high ceiling in Capella.
And here's the other thing I like about Capella, and maybe makes me not so wary of the questionable tag. I wouldn't necessarily say makes me like him, but makes me not wary of him. He's been listed as questionable for every single preseason game, and then he ends up starting anyway, and he plays like 25 minutes. So I don't know why it is that they keep listing him as questionable. We see that with NBA teams that just have certain players where for whatever reason, they're like, hey, this guy just automatically gets listed as questionable every game for us for forever. And that's kind of what we see with Clint Capella. So I'm not taking it too seriously. I assume he starts. Obviously, I'd feel differently if he's not in the starting lineup, but as long as he's in there, I assume he's going to get the 25 minutes and he makes for a pretty good value play at the 5,700 price tag. Because like you said, he's very well established as a good permanent fantasy producer. And since we have other guys on the slate like Nikola Vucevic and Jonas Valanciunas that people are going to gravitate towards, and Thomas Bryant also, I think that Clint Capella is probably going to be a good contrarian play. I just don't think that people are going to want to click his name considering the questionable tag.
Yeah, and I will mention too, he's listed as probable on the injury report. He's listed as questionable on DraftKings. So it's a situation where like you said, I think people maybe don't want to click the Q tag, but he's actually probable. So there's even less risk there than there would be otherwise.
Yeah, and then also, like I said, I mean, it's been his designation every single game so far, so it is what it is. We still have a lot of time left, so if anybody has questions, fire those in, and we can get to whatever those that we want. Something else I think we could talk about: who are your overall favorite value plays on DraftKings? I'm going to look to see if we have a Hornets starting lineup yet, which we do not. So overall top value plays, who if you could only roster, I'll put it this way. If you could roster one guy priced under 5,000, who would that player be?
Under 5,000. So I would be looking. So I'll start by saying I don't think there's anybody under 5K that I like truly like on their own merits. So I'm looking to the shooting guard position or the small forward position because those have the lowest opportunity cost. And at that point, you're looking at basically Bogdanovic, Melton, and Fournier. I think that I lean towards Bogdanovic there. As I said, I'm assuming he starts. I'd lose a little bit of interest if he comes off the bench, but still think he'd be perfectly fine. But yeah, I think it's Bogdanovic, or sorry, he's 5,200, so he doesn't count. So I guess I'd go to the small forward position and look to like either Josh Jackson there or look to Fournier at 4,800 at shooting guard.
Yeah, and I'll add Denny Avdija into there also. Somebody played over 30 minutes for the Wizards last game. He's going to be starting. And with the limited minutes for Westbrook and Beal, I think there's a pretty good chance that Denny ends up picking up, plus 30 minutes and decent usage, just considering that the stars are probably not going to play a whole lot of minutes. But yeah, other than that, I'm not sure there's one guy who's like at 4,100 that's necessarily a must play. In terms of FanDuel options, who do you think are the top guys to pay up for? Just because, salary doesn't matter. So we're just looking at total points for the most part. Who are some of the top guys for you? I know for me, I'll say Trey Young, John Morant for sure. And then if we look at the center position, I think this is where it gets trickiest is Nikola Vucevic or Jonas Valanciunas. Who do you think is the better FanDuel center?
I think it's Vooch in cash. He just, I think, projects as the top scorer, but the ceiling is so high for Valanciunas that because most people will play Vooch, I think you can go to Valanciunas in tournaments. Bryant and Capella become a little bit riskier because there's a pretty good chance that at least one of Vooch and Valanciunas are going for like 35 or 40 FanDuel points, which, is asking a lot out of Bryant or Capella. But I do think using Vooch in tournaments Vooch in cash and Valanciunas in tournaments is a pretty good strategy there. As far as overall guys, I have Vooch at the top, and then it's Morant, Valanciunas, Young. I think Collins is the top power forward there. I think that in tournaments, if you're trying to do something other than Morant and Young at point guard, which won't feel very good, but I'd be looking to like Markelle Fultz or LaMelo.
And then I think, and then we can get to some of these questions because we have some of them piling up here. How about somebody who's a contrarian option at the forward position that has a potential to be one of the top 2 scoring forwards, just because power forward is such a thin position on FanDuel. And it is one spot that I think it is pretty hard to find somebody who's going to be a top option. For me, I'll say PJ Washington. I don't know if he necessarily qualifies as really contrarian, but I think he's somebody who maybe people wouldn't think of as somebody who's definitely going to be one of the highest scorers, but I think he's somebody who has a chance.
Yeah, I think that on FanDuel, this is where if you're somebody looking to roster Aaron Gordon or Brandon Clarke, this is where you do it. Because I think that so my top 2 projected power forwards are Collins and Gordon, but because so many people are going, there's a lack of preseason content, and so a lot of people are going to just kind of apply the same or to some extent, the same top plays from DraftKings to FanDuel. I think you'll probably get more ownership going to PJ Washington than Aaron Gordon. And I expect, a couple more minutes for Washington, but Gordon obviously produces at a high rate. So whereas he's not really in play on DraftKings with salaries, I think Gordon looks really good there. And then Brandon Clarke too is someone that the minutes are an issue, and I don't want to pay a salary on DraftKings, but we saw plenty of times last year that, he comes off the bench and for one reason or another picks up a few extra minutes, whether it's Valanciunas being in foul trouble or Clarke just playing his way onto the floor basically, and puts up a really big game. So the opportunity cost really is not that high at power forward on FanDuel. The only like real power forward options are like Collins, Washington. The only power forward options on FanDuel that are like plays on DraftKings are Collins, Washington, and Blake Griffin. So I assume most of the ownership is going to be concentrated around those guys, and looking to an Aaron Gordon or Brandon Clarke in tournaments as a contrarian option makes sense.
And then we have a question here about who do we think is going to score the most fantasy points at shooting guard on FanDuel? It's pretty funny because, the shooting guard options here, there's really only 3 guys that I view as all that likely, and that's Bogdanovich, Brooks, and Graham. Other than that, then it drops off to we've got Terrence Ross coming off the bench. We've got Cody Martin. So I think it's really between Bogdanovich, Brooks, and Graham. So if you had to roster 2 of those guys on FanDuel, who would be the 2 for you? I'm leaning towards Graham and Bogdanovich. Graham
and Brooks are my top 2. I'm with you on Bogdanovich being in there too. The one guy I would throw in is Bradley Beal, who only played in the first half last game. He might just play in the first half again tonight, but even if you get to 20 minutes on Beal, he would come in as my 3rd projected guy on FanDuel. And again, behind Graham and Brooks, but I just assume nobody's going to roster Bradley Beal because there's no real reason to. So in tournaments, that's someone that clearly, if Beal goes and scores 32 fantasy points in 20 minutes, nobody's going to be too shocked that he did that. So that's kind of in that same vein as like Aaron Gordon and Brandon Clarke, someone that I think you can just look to for raw points on FanDuel.
So somebody's asking us here, what are our thoughts on Mason Plumlee? And here's the deal. It is obviously going to be a favorable matchup against the Wizards. Even if it's Wizards starters, backups, whoever's playing, they're going to give up a ton of fantasy points this year. I have very little doubt about that. But the issue I have with Mason Plumlee is just the opportunity cost, because there are so many good center plays on this slate between Vucevic, Thomas Bryant, Valanciunas. We said we like Clint Capella, that he becomes very low priority. And I think that if you're rostering him, you're just giving up too much. in terms of rostering one of these other guys that I think has much more upside, makes for a better play. So that's kind of where I'm off Plumlee. Do you feel much differently, or because of the matchup, do you think that makes him viable anyway?
It's the same boat for me. The biggest problem is just the opportunity cost. Like think all the way through your lineup. If you save money at center and pay down for Mason Plumlee, who even if he plays 20 to 22 minutes, can certainly be a good value from a point per dollar standpoint in this matchup. But so you say you pay down for Plumlee, what are you like doing with your savings? Because there's a really good chance that some combination of Vooch, Valanciunas, Bryant, Capella, that these guys are putting up some of the highest raw scores on the slate. So you're by definition giving up at least one of them to roster Plumlee. And then you need to make up for those points, but you can't make up for them at small forward because there's nobody on the slate to pay up for there. You can't really make up for it at shooting guard because we're not expecting Beal to play enough minutes, and he's really the only guy to pay up for there. People are going to be able to roster Trey Young or Morant with two of the good centers anyway, so it's not like you're gaining on them by doing that. So it really just puts you in a position where you have to make up points, most likely, unless something really weird happens on the slate. You're going to have to make up points that you're giving up at center, but the players that you would expect to make them up just don't exist on the slate, so it gets really tough.
All right, guys, do us a favor because we are taking we are taking questions from the YouTube chat. So please like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel so that when next year comes around, you can also get all of your NBA preseason questions answered before the last show of the season ends. So definitely subscribe so you know when preseason 2021 goes live and you get access to all those shows immediately. Let's see other questions we have here. Thoughts on Dwayne Bacon? Just low priority guy for me, low per minute fantasy producer. The other thing too is the Hornets kind of sneakily have a bunch of high usage guys in their lineup between Terry Rozier, Devontae Graham, LaMelo Ball when he's on the court, and Miles Bridges to an extent also. There's a lot of guys on there that need to have the ball in their hands.
He's on the other side of that game now.
What did I say? Bacon. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I totally screwed that up.
I did it last night with Billy Donovan, started talking about Orlando or Oklahoma City.
All right, so go ahead. What are your thoughts on Dwayne Bacon then? Since I've already messed this up.
I agreed with everything you said up until Terry Rozier's usage affecting him, but still a low priority guy. And the same points that you were making about the Hornets apply to the Magic as well. Like Markelle Fultz isn't giving up shots to Dwayne Bacon. Neither is Vooch. Neither is Aaron Gordon. He's kind of just out there soaking up minutes. It's not, and even like. The scoring from that position is going to be when Terrence Ross comes into the game. So it's just not a slate where I think I need to be going there. I'm not expecting him to play enough minutes to get to be a really useful piece just based on being on the floor. And I can roster the guys that I want to pay up for without having to go to Dwayne Bacon. Like I'd rather be going to like better per minute players and taking a chance on guys like Josh Jackson or Jeremy Grant or Denny or, guys like that where I expect them to get mid to upper 20s in minutes and just produce at a higher rate than Dwayne Bacon.
Yeah, it's been pointed out in the chat too that neither of us have come close to pronouncing Denny's last name right. It'll help once I actually hear an announcer say his name out, phonetically. But I mean, I'm looking at it online and trying to read it how it's pronounced in the phonetics put out, and I'm still pretty sure that I'm not close to getting it right. I am trying, but it is not coming out right at all. Let's see other questions in the chat here. Any thoughts on Hunter? He's definitely not a high priority guy for me. One of the issues too is he's pretty expensive for a guy who didn't produce well from a fantasy perspective last year.
Avdia, according to the internet.
Is that not what I was saying before? I don't know what I was saying before.
I think you said it once. It might have been by accident, but I think you did get it right once. I didn't hear your question, though. I was looking up pronunciation.
So DeAndre Hunter, who I think is a little bit overpriced and is not a particularly great per minute fantasy producer. And then also talking about players that are playing with guys who are high usage players, assuming that the Hawks are going to have, Trey Young, Kevin Huerter, John Collins, Clint Capella in the starting lineup. There's just not that many touches to go around to DeAndre Hunter. And he was already a poor per minute. I can't pronounce anything now. A poor per minute fantasy producer last year. So with that in mind, I think that he makes for a pretty weak play, particularly at his price point.
Yeah, I agree with you. 0.76 DraftKings points per minute, including preseason since the start of last preseason, just has never really been a great producer. And then we talked about it a little bit when we talked about Trey Young, but there's a lot more mouths to feed on this Atlanta team this year. And DeAndre Hunter sure as hell is not going to be the one like taking the ball out of the hands of not only Young and Collins, but Capella or Bogdanovich. They're all going to be more involved in the offense. Cam Reddish, when he comes off the bench, is going to be more involved offensively than Hunter. So the salary really does become an issue for me. Like if he were 4,500 or 4,600 and in that same price tier as these other kind of mediocre small forwards that we've been talking about, then I would be interested just because I think he plays enough minutes to be useful. But at $1,000 more, I really just don't see a reason to be going to someone that is going to play similar minutes and produces fewer points per minute.
All right. And then one more question we have here, a 2v2 question in our Slack chat. Jonas Valanciunas and Bogdanovich or Vucevic and Melton. I'm going to lead towards Vucevic and Melton, particularly just because we don't know what the starting lineup is for the Hawks yet. So maybe that could change once we find out that, never mind, we just got the Atlanta Hawks starting lineup. Courtesy of News God, we do have Cam Reddish is in and he's going to be starting. So Trey Young, Cam Reddish, Hunter, Collins, and Capella. So this is something else we could talk about because we weren't really expecting Cam Reddish to be in the starting lineup. Now that we know that he is starting, what do you make of him as a play?
He becomes a little bit more appealing just because I expect him to play more minutes. The problem is that the rates, like playing alongside Trey Young and Collins, the rates aren't going to be great for Reddish. But, he is shooting guard small forward eligible at 5,100 on DraftKings. So if you think you can get 24, 25 minutes out of him, it does make him a little bit more appealing as a value. It also, I think, takes a little bit away from Bogdanovich, who probably loses a couple of minutes there. So it's still not, I'm still not excited about Reddish. I'd be more excited if he were like 4,500, but I think it does lower Bogdanovich a little bit too.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing you have to be concerned about is just what is the actual playing time that we're going to get out of Bogdanovich. It's hard to know coming off the bench. And the other thing too is don't forget, we've had Reddish missing in other preseason games. So that's just minutes that are going to go to somebody else. And I think it stands to reason that they want to get Reddish as many minutes as possible. And they want to see this starting lineup. They want to see different looks with this five together. Because I think that the Hawks are trying to figure out what is our starting lineup going to look like? What is our closing lineup going to look like to start the season? So I think that Bogdanovich coming off the bench is maybe a little bit of a red flag for him. Let's see if we have any other final questions. Just people generally who, I don't know how, but no matter what show I do, somehow drop roses in the chat and just Drew Lock becomes a topic of conversation because no matter what show he's watching, he stands for Drew Lock and tries to convince everybody that he's good. But no, Drew Lock, not good. I'm not watching the game. I assume he's playing poorly. That's probably a safe assumption. Denny or Jeremy Grant, which of them do you think makes for a better GPP play?
I think they're pretty much about the same. And it's really difficult to predict preseason ownership. In GPPs, I think I would lean towards Grant. And the reason is just the opportunities that he's been getting. I think he plays fewer minutes than Denny, but Grant does have a 28% usage rate in the preseason so far. All you need is it to be one game where his shot actually falls. And this is someone that we know can add some defensive stats and rebounding as well. So I think it's really close. I don't have a strong take one way or the other. I do think that Grant's usage will most likely be higher. And if he gets a couple extra minutes, then I'm expecting it maybe gives him a little bit higher ceiling, but I do think it's really close.
All right, let's see. I'm going to scan for any last questions. Who's your favorite small forward on FanDuel? Let me pull it up really quickly to see who are all the guys listed at small forward. At the top, we've got Denny, Troy Brown. Oh my God, this is a total train wreck of a position. All right, so let's see. It actually might be Evan Fournier, as ugly as that is to say. I think it's probably Fournier. Denny's in the mix also. And then also you kind of hope that, I know it doesn't matter because the prices are you just play whoever you want. I do wonder if people are a little influenced by Fournier being 2,000 and then Denny being 3,000. I think that might influence people to just roster the more expensive guy, even when it doesn't matter. I'm going to go with Fournier as my top overall small forward on FanDuel.
Yeah, he's number one for me. There's 6 guys that I think are like exactly the same with Fournier, Anderson, Denny, Reddish, Jackson, Grant. I think I would go Fournier 1, Anderson 2.
And then Thomas Bryant or Clint Capella, which of them do you think is the better play on DK? That's probably going to be Thomas Bryant for me, especially because we don't have Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook playing full minutes. So that's something that leads me towards Thomas Bryant probably picking up a little bit extra usage.
Yeah, I think they're really close. That's actually a decision I'd been going back and forth on in my DraftKings lineup was, kind of I had the money for Bryant, but I wasn't sure I actually liked him more than Capella. But I do think a slight edge to Bryant, but it's definitely not a spot where if saving that $500 gets you anything, I don't have a problem with just going from Bryant to Capella.
All right, and then let's see. Every time I think that we've run through all of the questions, something else pops up. Thoughts on Doomboya? I feel like people are just trying to make me say difficult names now. Dr. Doom, as we'll call him, Sekou Doumbouya. No interest for me. I think that he was somebody who was fairly decently regarded coming out of the draft last year. Somebody who could be an upside player. And he had some moments as a value play, but overall he proved to not be a very good permanent fantasy producer. So no real interest for me on this slate.
No, me neither.
And is that going to finally do it? Yeah, people just keep asking about the FanDuel small forward plays, which we said it before, it's Fournier for me as the top overall one, but it's slim pickings there. They all kind of suck. A lot of guys who are similar. And then just to reiterate what I said before, I think people might just stay away from Fournier because he sucked last game and he's 2,000 where the other guys are 3,000. So that helps him out a little bit. And that is going to wrap up the show. That is about as much as we can talk about a 3-game NBA preseason slate. So with that in mind, guys, thank you so much for sticking around and watching our NBA preseason content. Ab and I really appreciate it. We did a bunch of shows together. On the way out, please give us a thumbs up, like the show, and then also subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're about to be talking about actual real NBA games, not preseason. We're just kind of guessing what happens. We're going to have actual projections on the Awesemo site, which you can get if you use the promo code Caruso for just $1. That'll get you access to all of our tools for the first week of the NBA season if you're a new customer. So guys, also subscribe to that YouTube channel. When we start doing live before locks for real NBA games, you're going to want to get that kind of information. So subscribe, and we hope to see you when the season starts. Jordan, play the music out.